I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. This week, San Antonio Express News business reporter Richard Webner penned an update on the controversial apartment complex project that some say will negatively affect the Hayes Street Bridge area, while others call the planned build something that will alleviate crime and vagrancy problems while also improving the East Side's tax base. So, now to get the full story, I'm joined for the first time here on the podcast by Express News business reporter Richard Webner. So, Richard, let's start first with the basics. Go a little back to how this apartment project came to be, and then we'll start talking about these updates.
Well, it's a very long and complicated story, really. It started off when the Hayes Street Bridge Restoration Group, which is this nonprofit that originally raised money for the bridge, they persuaded the previous owner of the property to donate the vacant lot to the city with the understanding that it would be used for a park. The city went ahead and sold it to a developer who originally planned to build a brewery there, but when the restoration group sued to try to stop that from happening, that developer passed it along to another developer who came up with these plans to build the apartment complex. So this has all been happening over the course of the last 5 or 6 years.
And so obviously now you just mentioned a lawsuit with a different project. Now we're looking at this apartment building. And I've reported for our Express Briefing podcast that's available Monday through Friday around 5 a.m. And you can check that out at expressnews.com/podcast. I've been reporting on that from time to time on these kind of apartment building protests, these people, individuals, and also groups that have gone about getting their voices heard in opposition to what we're discussing now today. Was that almost immediate when this apartment complex idea came out, or did that take a little bit of time for that protest movement to start beginning and have their voices heard?
I think that there have always been a lot of people who have been opposed to it. Many of them are opposed because they feel that the property should not be developed on at all, that it should just be a park as they feel that the city originally promised. Since this apartment complex was first proposed last year, I think a lot of people have also been worried that it doesn't fit into the area. If you've been to this neighborhood, there are a lot of old single-family homes, and I don't think they like the idea of a 5-story apartment complex being there next to these tiny homes. They also feel like it would block views of the bridge. And the first design, which the HDRC, the city's historic commission, turned down last year. A lot of people felt like it was really ugly. It had a parking garage facing the street. The developer came out with this new design earlier this year, and it met with a little bit better of a reception from people in the neighborhood, but there's still a lot of opposition to it.
And so you just mentioned design, Richard. That's actually my next question. As you mentioned, the design has changed over time, and city manager Cheryl Scully has also been part of that equation. Tell me about how she fits into the puzzle.
Well, she came in relatively late. After the HDRC, which is the city commission that looks over developments that are in historic areas, after the HDRC turned down the project for the second time on a very narrow vote, Cheryl Scully came in and she did something which is very, very rare. She reversed the recommendation of the HDRC because the HDRC is technically an advisory board. So she said, despite what the HDRC decided, I am going to approve this project with certain stipulations. And then she listed a bunch of design changes that she wanted the developer and the community to negotiate over. Some of them included keeping the lighting unobtrusive, lowering the height, sort of making it so it's less monolithic, and there were some other ones as well.
But correct me if I'm wrong, at least some of those ideas are no longer part of the project.
Well, yes. So the developer and the neighborhood association for Dignity Hill, where it would be built, they've been meeting, and they have negotiated in a way where the neighborhood association has more or less said, you don't have to do many of these things that the city manager said you should do. And now there's some dispute over what the city manager exactly meant in her letter, whether she meant that you have to do these things or you should negotiate over whether to do these things. Opponents are saying that the city manager said you have to do these things. I got a response from the city yesterday where they seem to indicate that the stipulations that she made are open to some flexibility.
And so you just mentioned the neighborhood association. That's something specifically, Richard, that you reported on this week. And you can check out that article at expressnews.com. This newly announced support by the neighborhood association for the apartment complex project. Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, that's another twist in this whole thing. So the Dignity Hill Neighborhood Association, it has this committee called the Architectural Review Committee that looks over proposed designs for new developments in the neighborhood. And the Architectural Review Committee had been a lot of the members had been opposed to this project. And the neighborhood association had elections earlier this year, and this new president came on board. And one of the first things that he did was he essentially purged that architectural review committee. He basically replaced its members with new members that he picked himself. And that's important because the city manager said that one of the conditions of her approval was that the developer and this architectural review committee need to agree on a new design. So now there's a new architectural review committee, so it makes it a lot easier for the developer.
So, Richard, obviously, we've been talking about this apartment complex and how that might negatively or perhaps in a good way affect the Hayes Street Bridge area. But how does this fit into just generally what's happening on the east side? Obviously, this isn't the only construction project that's been going on.
Well, the east side has long been a neglected area of San Antonio. It has struggled with poverty. It's a largely minority area. And but over the last couple of years, you've had people moving in from elsewhere and fixing up old homes, building townhomes on empty lots, opening up new retail businesses. You'll see lots of at least a couple craft beer places over there. So there's been a debate over whether this is good for the East Side or not. I was actually just speaking with an East Side leader named Jackie Gorman about this recently. And, she and other people are happy to see this new development. They're happy to see vacant lots be filled in. But there's also concern over the culture of the East Side being diluted, over property taxes soaring for the people who have lived there for a long time, which is a real problem over there.
Has the city or the neighborhood association said or done anything to try to alleviate these fears associated with either this specific apartment complex or just generally for what's been happening on the east side?
Yeah, I think that you see the city and other local government entities starting to take it a little bit more seriously. I know Bexar County this week, I think they voted on a new homestead tax exemption for seniors, and Mayor Nierenberg seems to be making affordable housing more of a focus. His housing task force, I think, just issued their recommendations, and I think those will be decided soon. So you're starting to see more of a response to it, but I'm actually currently working on a story about rising property taxes, and people who live in that part of town are very angry about it. So I think that they feel that there has not been much of a response to it, that their property taxes go up significantly every single year, and it's really straining their budgets.
So look for something along those lines in the paper, the physical copy, or check it out here in the future at expressnews.com. So now let's talk, Richard, about the final steps, or at least the next steps with this project, both for the people who are for it and against it. Where do you see this going from both sides?
It's hard to say. I think that the developer and the city feel that his path is more or less clear at this point. He still needs to get the approval of. Well, he still needs to get final approval from the city manager, Cheryl Scully. The design review committee of the HDRC will recommend to her whether to approve it or not, and then she gets final say. I think that the developer and his attorney and a lot of the other people who support this project feel confident that he will get that. But at the same time, you still have this lawsuit, which the Texas Supreme Court decided last week that they would hear arguments related to this lawsuit, which it's very complicated what's going on with that lawsuit. It would probably be difficult to describe everything here, but the Supreme Court will basically be deciding whether the city has immunity to this lawsuit, and the city seems to believe that even if the Supreme Court and the Texas Appeals Court rules against it, that it will not affect this development. But people who oppose the development and the Hay Street Bridge Restoration Group, they feel that there's a chance that if things go their way, that the city's original sale of the land to a developer could be nullified and that the land could end up being used for a park. So that's still hanging over everything. But like I said, the developer and people who support this development seem to think that everything is clear and that construction will be able to begin at some point in the not distant future.
And before we wrap up with final thoughts, I want to focus a little bit on what you just mentioned there. From what you know from all the reporting you've done and the people you spoke with, do you think that there is a legitimate reason for people who are against this project for one reason or another to think that there is still a pathway to stop it? Or as you just mentioned, with the developer thinking he has a clear pathway, do you think that's maybe more likely the case?
It's really difficult for me to say that. I'm not a legal expert, and it's hard for me to say how much of a chance they really have in front of the Texas Supreme Court. I mean, all I can say is that the Supreme Court did decide to take their case, and I think that they see that as a very positive thing. And a Bexar County jury did decide in favor of the opponents of the project several years ago before the city appealed that decision to the appeals court. So I think that they do have reason to feel that things could go their way. The city is adamant that even if things do go in the direction of the opponents, that it will not affect the original sale of this land. The opponents disagree with that. So you have people saying different things here.
And then, Richard, final thoughts, anything that we haven't discussed or anything that you want to go back to before we say goodbye?
All I can say is I think that this is a really interesting issue. I can see it from both points of view, really. I like to go to the Hay Street Bridge pretty often, and it's a beautiful bridge. I mean, if you ever get a chance to go jogging or ride your bike there in the early morning, it's great. You always see people there enjoying it. It does have a problem with vagrancy. You can go there and you see people drinking and you can smell people smoking weed sometimes. So I can understand the argument of people who say that building this apartment complex and putting more eyes on the bridge would be helpful to the area. But then again, I can understand people who are concerned about gentrification and losing the view of that beautiful bridge. So it's a really interesting story, I think.
And then I guess my final question, Richard, is since you said you do enjoy going there, if you imagine, that apartment complex being there, not there now, but imagine, it's there, would that change your plans? Might you go somewhere else?
I think I would probably still go there. If it's one of the best places to go to get a view of San Antonio's skyline, and the bridge would not affect that. The bridge would affect views of the bridge from elsewhere in the neighborhood, but it would not affect the view of San Antonio's skyline from the bridge.
Excellent. Well, I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News business reporter Richard Webner. He's been covering this controversy about this apartment complex we've discussing and how it might positively or perhaps negatively affect the Hay Street Bridge and the area. Thank you for speaking with me, Richard, and I look forward to finding perhaps more reports on this issue in the future.
Yes, thank you very much.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News business reporter Richard Webner for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.